Welcome to our Bivariate presentation on support for women's rights in Algeria. The concept of universal human rights, regardless of race, gender, or personal affiliation, is seen as an inherently Western idea. This is in contrast to the perception of traditional Islamic culture as oppressive to women. We would like to examine support for women's rights in Algeria, specifically whether exposure to Western culture increases support and belief in Islamic law decreases support for women's rights. Our research uses the 2007 Arab Barometer focusing in Algeria. The number of respondents is 1,300. Our methods include Cronbach's alpha, bivariate cross-tabulations, analysis of variance and Sheffe test, chi-square test, Kendall's tau B and tau C. The reliability analysis measures support for women's rights, which includes equal opportunity, education, occupation, political participation, and freedom of movement. This reliability test produced a Cronbach alpha score of 0.8015, showing that these indicators provide a good measure for our concept.
The dependent variable was created by recoding the index into three categories based on the cumulative percentages. The three categories reflect low, moderate, and high support for women's rights. The dependent variable produced a median of 2, indicating a middle value and a range of 2. The dependent variable also produced a skew of -0.120 and a kurtosis of -1.474. This indicates a left-skewed, relatively flat distribution curve.
Our first hypothesis is that respondents who disagree that Western culture is harmful are more likely to have high support for women's rights. This is based on the rationale that those hostile towards Western culture may see feminism as an extension of Western culture and therefore reject it. Our second hypothesis is that respondents who have spent more time in the United States or other Western countries are more likely to have higher support for women's rights. This is based on the rationale that exposure to Western culture may demonstrate to the individual the benefits of liberating women. Our third hypothesis is that support for women's rights increases as responses favoring authoritarianism and Islamic law decrease. This is based on the rationale that Islamic culture fosters the degradation of women as a group and doesn't encourage their liberation from a subordinate position to men.
In the literature supporting our first hypothesis, Anur argues that feminism seen as a Western concept and traditional Islamic culture are mutually exclusive. In the literature supporting our second hypothesis, Antelis argues that Western culture has specific codified ideas of human rights and equality, including gender equality. In the literature supporting our third hypothesis, both Anur and Hirsi Ali argue that Islamic culture has evolved into a patriarchal and oppressive climate towards women. The cross-tabulation of our first independent variable shows a high level of support for women's rights among those who strongly disagree that Western culture is harmful. While the chi-square indicates that this minimal relationship is highly unlikely to be occurring by sampling error, the relationship is nonetheless substantively weak as seen by the tau C value of 0.10.
The cross-tabulation of the second independent variable shows that time spent in the West may have a minimal effect on support for women's rights. The cross-tabulation produces a chi-square p-value that shows a less than 1 in 100,000 chance of the results occurring by sampling error. The tau b value of 0.17 shows a minimal relationship between the two variables. The cross-tabulation of the third independent variable shows a trend of support for women's rights increasing as support for an Islamic system of governance decreases. A Sheffe test indicates a significant difference between the not suitable category and the other three categories. The crosstab also produces a tau c value of 0.27, showing a strong relationship between the two variables. The chi-square value indicates a less than 1 in 100,000 chance of the results occurring by sampling error.
In summary, there is a lack of clear relationship between favorability toward Western culture and support of feminism, contradicting the literature produced here. A statistically significant, yet minimal relationship between support for women's rights and time spent in Western countries provides some support for the second hypothesis that Western culture has at least minor influence. A very strong, significant relationship between low support for women's rights and support for Islamic law greatly supports our third hypothesis that undemocratic Islamic law is unfavorable towards feminism. To conclude, the data demonstrates that support for women's rights and feminism must grow from within Algeria's Islamic culture. This is because exposure to and favorability of Western culture has only a minimal effect on support for women's rights. At the same time, it shows clearly that undemocratic Islamic rule hinders women's rights. Potential further study could focus on the effect of modernization, economic conditions, support for democratic and secularization.